Hey folks, it is January 27th, and for today's Dole Credit 1301 course, we are going to begin our unit over the American Revolution. Um, this section is kind of going to be paired with what I like to call the constitutional creation period. So a lot of times you'll have the American Revolution period on its own, and then you'll have the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the early Republic pushed together. I'm considering kind of separating the Constitution on its own, like micro unit, just because it's an important thing because it defines how the United States national government works out, but also the rights for states and individuals as well. But we'll see when we get there. I am, however, going to tell you that we are going to have a test after this unit. And so when we're done with the American Revolution, your first test will be over the American colonies, colonization, and also the American Revolution. It is strongly suggested that you read the chapters over that unit because it will help you with the test. So let's go ahead and begin. All right, so the American Revolution period, 1765 to 1883. And so we all know that the American Revolution did not start in 1765, but we see a lot of the things that lead up to separation between America and England before the war began, right? There's always cause and effect. Wars don't just happen because, I might seem that way sometimes, but especially when you're trying to explain a complicated one, like why did the Vietnam War happen? Well, it's a little fishy. All right. So if you'll recall, we discussed that we had the French and Indian War, in which the Americans, who were British citizens or subjects, fight alongside the British against the French in Canada. And here is a picture of, what's his name? Early on in the war, tragic death, British general, and his name escapes me. But despite some initial losses, the British are going to pull through and win this war. But as we've seen, it's going to be extremely expensive because it's going to be a world war. And it's going to be a naval war. And it's going to be, of course, a land forces war. And of course, you have to pay for auxiliary forces, such as Native Americans, but also mercenary troops, which were a very used thing back then. So, causes for tension. This is a term you may have heard before a long time ago, salutary neglect. So, up until the French and Indian War, Britain spent little attention on colonies due to their 3,000-mile distance. We talked about this the other day. We talked about that was one of the differences between Spanish colonies and British colonies. In Spain, they wanted to have more direct control. However, the more they tried to have direct control of their colonies, the more their colonies would simply ignore them. In England, however, they allowed colonies to largely run their affairs on their own, as long as they said that they were citizens of the crown or subjects of the crown. Victory doubled the size of Britain's North American holdings, leading to more attention. They're like, wow, we have so much more territory down there now. Some of it's been developed by the French. And as we mentioned last time, Proclamation Line of 1763. This prevented colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so if you'll recall, last time I discussed that there were reasons why the colonists wanted to push out west for more land. You have to push pull factors with human migration. And the pull factors, of course, was more farmland, opportunity, independence, things like that. Living the ideal farmer, frontiersman lifestyle. And the push factors were they're just simply running out of land in the east. There was nowhere to have that farm for reasons we pointed out last time. Now, people are going to be very upset that the crown is going to tell them, hey, you can't go past this line. but they're also going to get more upset because they're going to let Canadians move further west anyways. Like, how come they get to do it? We just fought a war against those folks, but you won't let us, your loyal subjects, do it. So they were a little peeved about it, right?
Wait, could you go back a little bit?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So, um, as we mentioned, a lot of the Native Americans up in these times, and we're going to see this a long time. Like the Spanish and the French are going to do it against each other. Of course, France and Britain, as we already talked about, do it. But Native Americans are going to use the imperial powers, the European powers against one another, but also they in turn will be used through bribes, through treaties, through military coercion, stuff like that. So it's going to be very disruptive to these people who live there. Causes for tension continued. Around 10,000 troops were sent from Britain to protect the new frontiers. So now all of a sudden they had a military force in the colonies. However, a lot of the colonies pointed out that these soldiers, these teams of soldiers who now came to the colonies, were not protecting them from Indian attacks or from foreign countries. They were mostly acting as a police force against the colonists. So they're like, hey, wait a second. We really trust you. We've been allowed to take care of our affairs. We've needed your help in the past. You never gave it to us. And now all of a sudden you sent soldiers here to kind of like push us around. So once again, lots of tensions are building up after the French and Indian War. The British needed to pay for expenses of the French and Indian War. Britain wanted the colonists to pay 1/3 of the annual cost for the war. So they weren't asking the colonists to pay for the entire price of it. But in the past, colonists didn't have a problem so much with paying taxes. But we come back to that slogan, no taxation without representation. One thing they don't like is the idea that taxes are going to be pushed on them without any input from them. So that's going to be a big problem for these folks. The Prime Minister George Grenville and King George III then led the way for Parliament to pass a number of taxes, as we'll see later, intending to help pay for the cost of protecting the colonies and to flex the authority of the king. So, as we're going to see, there's going to be a lot of give and take. Parliament, led by the crown, would of course bring various taxes against the colonists, rather small, honestly, compared to what the British were paying. The colonists are only going to be asked to pay a small portion of what a British citizen living in England would have to pay. But it's not the amount of money that really bothered the colonies. It's the fact that they were being treated not as British subjects, not as citizens of their country. They were essentially being treated as foreigners. And that was very insulting to the colonists, right? So, like, how come if I lived in England, I would get to do this? But since I don't live there, I'm being told to do that. So. Thanks. Oh yeah, just a reminder, yeah, like we mentioned, the A and B schedules on the Google Classroom, but we're not gonna have this class on Friday. So, B day, B day. So here we see some symbols that have to do a lot with the idea of liberty. Whenever you see this on the end of a stick, it's called a liberty cap. So it's supposed to represent freedom. But we see a lot of things here that are very big American tradition. We have protest where effigies of people you don't like, usually government officials, like scarecrows dressed like them, are being like hung and burned and beheaded and stabbed and stuff like that. These protests usually had to do with a lot of noise, beating up these officials and running them out of town, breaking their windows, burning down their homes, and occasionally, we'll see later on, they'll be tarred and feathered. And of course, tarring is extremely nasty because you have to boil the stuff and you cover somebody's skin with this boiling liquid that you can't pull off, which causes, massive 3rd or 4th degree burns throughout their body. And then you cover them with feathers and make them run off screaming. So sometimes you had to face that. So it goes to show this is kind of like that popular chaotic part of the revolutionary spirit, right? And so it sounds pretty wild, it sounds pretty violent, but if you compare it to like the French Revolution later, it's going to be a lot more tame, a whole lot more tame. And it's also going to have leadership that will help direct it and calm it down and organize it better as well. So, a tax ban coming. Britain's national debt nearly doubled after the end of the French and Indian War. So, it's crazy. So, it's like you could think of that as so you have the national debt in which the crown owes certain banks, sometimes foreign banks, money that they had to have lent to them in order to pay for things. Well, just this war alone doubled that. So you could kind of think of it like this was, I can't even compare it to like COVID measures because it's like something like the money supply in America has just like, what was it? It was something like, I gotta look up the chart. It was something like 75% of all money circulated was made in 2020. Like we spent so much and made so much money, like with the printer. So you can think of this as their version. Right? So the Sugar Act, 1764, enacted by Britain in order to increase state revenue and as a way to compete with cheap sugar grown by French, Dutch, Spanish colonies, taxed molasses from foreign colonies. We're going to find here that a lot of these taxes we're talking about are for specific commodities. And these specific commodities are controlled by monopolies. So what are the colonists doing when they're protesting them? When they protest these, they do not denounce their government. They do not insult their king. What they do is they protest a tax that's protecting private interests. That would be like all of a sudden, let's say the US government passed a tax to where you had to pay, I don't know, the YouTube tax or the Amazon tax. It's similar to that because you're going to have something called the East Indies Company, which is a joint stock monopoly that controls things like tea. And the government says it doesn't need to fall apart. We need to protect it. And so they impose taxes to protect a private company that's a monopoly. So think about that. The colonists, in a way, were actually at first not necessarily trying to protest hard their government, but at like a major corporation. So that's one angle to think about it. Colonists such as Samuel Adams and James Otis led protests in Boston. These guys were fiery, pro-liberty mindset guys. So they're very familiar with like the ideas of John Locke and people like that. And like I know in my government class we're going to read some of the writings of John Locke. And so that's one of the products of the Enlightenment, is the idea that everybody, because they're born in the image of God, has certain rights and liberty that other people should not and cannot realistically take away from you unless they're doing an evil act. Many, especially merchants, chose to boycott. So especially merchants. You could think of this, it's in Boston, it's in a city. During their time, I guess you could compare it like this is like a middle class revolution. It's not starting with like the poor beggars in the streets, and it's not starting with like the super wealthy. These are like business owners, people of trade and skill. Smugglers ship in illegal molasses to avoid taxes. Smugglers will become a very big group of heroes within the colonies and during the American Revolution. But that's a normal thing for colonies. Spanish colonies were notorious for their smugglers because the Spanish crown made it to where, by law, if you're like, Mexico or South America or in the Caribbean in one of the Spanish colonies, you could only buy Spanish products. You needed a hammer, you got to buy a Spanish hammer. You need a lantern, you got to buy a Spanish lantern. But smugglers would bring in cheaper ones from other countries. And so people just bought that instead. Well, it's similar here. You're going to find the colonies, once they start getting this control from the crown, smugglers are going to come up. And those smugglers are going to bring in these things. John Hancock has that big signature on the American Constitution. He's actually a smuggler. And he was so popular when the crown's soldiers capture him, they put him in jail. And they're going to haul him off to one of those secret courts they set up. The town comes together and literally tears down the wall to the jail and free him. So smugglers were super popular back then. They were like, hey, you're not breaking a bad law, it's helping us. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Sugar Act. So due to the boycotts, it was ineffective. Trying to enforce this tax cost them more money than it did to make them. So like, oh shoot, that was a mistake. They just didn't understand why it was like this either. They thought it must have been the wrong commodity. They didn't Parliament never listened to the colonies, never listened to what they had to say. They didn't know why the people in the colonies didn't want to pay the taxes. They figured, okay, wrong tax, wrong item, wrong amount of money. And eventually they're just going to say, well, these people are just incurably rebellious and we need to put them down. So, excuse me. You okay, Mariah? Hey, just checking on you. All right. So, all right, just a little bit longer. Can make it through it. Heck, I'm tired too. I don't know why I woke up an hour early. It stinks too, because when I wake up a little early, I can't go back to sleep. But if I wake up in the middle of the night, I can. All right, let's go on to the next one. All right. Yeah, it's getting to go Sam Adams. Well, at least it's not a unibrow, because especially those big bushy ones, and they just refuse to cut them. It's like, how could you not cut that? It's like, don't you ever see mirrors? But all right, whatever. There's actually there's a condition, and it can be common. It's most common with people with certain forms of schizophrenia, but can also be common in some people with bipolar disorder, where when they don't see themselves realistically, they see themselves frozen in a certain point of time. So they could be like 45, but they always see themselves as if they were 13 when they look in the mirror. Like a lot of homeless, a lot of homeless people have that. Like they don't understand that they got the big nasty beard and stuff like that, because they don't see that. It's It's kind of like a hallucination. All right, so stand back. 1765 taxed all printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, playing cards, legal documents. And so if you were going to do anything like get married, buy land, read, play, all of these things that have to have the official stamp from the government. And so they were like, wow, that's very intrusive. It's totalitarianism. You want us to pay in order to do almost anything. And so, as you can imagine, protests emerged in the colonies. No taxation without representation was the slogan. Many felt that they did not have a voice in Parliament, and they truly didn't. They truly didn't. Membership in Parliament came from divisions in England called boroughs, and some of these boroughs were actually just traditionally there, but didn't even have people. They might have been made like in the ancient times, and since then they would keep it around traditionally, and it was almost like a thing of inheritance, or it could be bought. So people would buy the ways in Parliament. However, the people in the colonies didn't have that voice, so they couldn't even get a vote. It was no representative government. It had no form of a republic. So, Sam Adams' group here, the Sons of Liberty, is formed, and the protests swept throughout New England. So it's centered around Boston, and England knows this. Boston is like the major shipping hub of the colonies, right? It's a big city. It's like where all the thriving commerce goes on, but it's going to start spreading. It's going to start spreading to other cities. Stamp distributors were intimidated and forced out of office, and so people were not complying. And now when we have intimidation, you're having things like threats and stuff like that. And so these officials are fleeing. At first, they have relatively no protection, police force protection. But we will see coming up that eventually their officials will get protection behind a red dressed army. And of course, the Sons of Liberty, they're also they're putting out information like pamphlets or broadsides, you could call them, which is essentially like a document you can like glue on the side of a building so everybody can read it, like a poster. They would have their own printing press running, information networks. Towns and cities alike had taverns where people would get together and they would talk about these things. They would hear the news of the day. It went from being something that was more secretive or more of a high-minded idea that gentlemen would talk about. Now more and more normal, common, everyday people were hearing about this and being incensed by what they saw as injustice. And so the revolutionary fervor is coming up.
No more taxes.
Well, good luck with that. I mean, you could always not pay taxes if you're willing to like deal with the consequences.
For sure.
It is a form of nonviolent protest. Just look at Henry David Thoreau. He went
Is
to
it
jail.
really?
Yeah. Like if you're like, there's something I don't want to pay taxes for. Like Henry David Thoreau, he refused to pay taxes because he didn't want to pay for a government that waged war on Mexico and enforced slavery. I was like, I'm not paying your taxes because you do these things. So you can see other people perhaps making that choice. It's a little harder these days because your taxes, sales taxes are automatic. Income tax for most people is automatic. It's just not taken out by your employer. So.
You're right.
Unless you make a certain threshold, if you make too much money, then you have to pay into it. And then like when it's time to file your tax return, you gotta fix it. All that. And if you own your own business, well, good luck. I don't know what to do then. I know it's hard with them. I know that. All right, so can I move on next one? Yes. give me liberty or give me death. So we're going to see that once the colonists send letters of protest and try to send delegates to go talk to Parliament, and they are constantly told, we will not listen to you, you are rebellious, we're not going to give your letters the time of day, you're going to start seeing that more and more people in the colonies are going to say, well, it's off, forget it then. Because if we can't even communicate with you, if we can't even if you won't even hear what we have a problem with, then maybe we need to be something else. So, Sons of Liberty is forms of protest, formed protest throughout the colonies. I must have been dozing off. These patriots used both nonviolent and violent means to intimidate British officials, as we talked about earlier. We're going to have such things as the Virginia Resolves. Now, Virginia was not known for its big cities. It had, if you recall, it was mostly agricultural, especially through its plantations. But one thing about these plantation owners is that they considered themselves, remember, like well-to-do, educated British gentlemen, right? And one of the things that these guys would do is they would have like lending libraries. And so we know people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they would send each other books, and they would keep their libraries revolving around, and they were all reading the same things regarding new forms of government as brought up by Enlightenment thinkers, like we mentioned John Locke, and of course Montesquieu and others. And so everybody's reading these materials and really thinking about how things could be. And so Boston and New England wasn't the only place where people were like, yeah, we need something different. This isn't right. In this Virginia Assembly, Patrick Henry gave his liberty or death speech and helped write the Virginia Resolves, denying Parliament's right to tax them. And so it's a fiery speech. It's kind of like a crescendo. It starts out kind of calm, and then it gets more and more and more, and just excited, and where there's calls for his arrest afterwards. People were clapping and cheering him on, where he is actually calling for that separation from England. And we're going to see at first, when people start calling for an American Revolution, they're going to call for it to be against Parliament. They blame Parliament. And we're like, we know that Parliament's the one who makes these tax laws. And we know that the king is always on the side of those people, always our protector. But eventually that's going to change as well. Eventually the colonies are going to start saying, well, the crown is responsible for this. King George has done X, Y, and Z, and we know that he's the one who could have fixed this, and he chose not to. And so, once again, however, Parliament doesn't listen. This is the Staff Act Congress here in America. So the colonies are going to get together and decide we have to do something. So they're going to, 9 of the 13 are going to send delegates in New York, and they're all going to agree to boycott all British imports. I'm going to say it's just not enough. A Stamp Act essentially taxes almost everything that's important to us. We're just going to boycott all of it. And so during this time, you're going to start having a lot of homespun industries come up. Wives are going to take up to start making more of their own clothing and repairing clothes, fixing clothes for people. People are going to try to import less and less British goods, including it's very British to drink tea, right? So it was a very patriotic, but it was also a cultural thing. And so during this time, Americans are going to start drinking coffee. And so coffee is going to start becoming more of an American tradition. And this is going to help some small industries start to come up too, to fill in that void. It's like, we're not buying things from England. We got to start making it ourselves. So, all right, we're going to do one more. I'm going to call it that. All right. don't know why. My memory is so terrible. That was, I didn't even put the name up there. Gosh. Okay. So the British are going to be very mad about this. If there's one way to really make the British government notice you, it's hurting the country's money. Like, you look at like Ireland, right? For a long time in the 20th century, Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland were separated. They had a lot of violence, bombings, gun battles. The British would send in troops to round up these folks, sometimes committing atrocities, but sometimes being murdered. And sometimes it would be neighborhood versus neighborhood. Well, the one way that Northern Ireland actually got the British to pull their troops out is they started bombing their version of Wall Street.
No.
And once all their banks kept closing down, the British was like, okay, we're going to get our troops out of there. And it stopped it. And so here we have the American colonies. They're like, all right, we're going to boycott England stuff. And England's going to be like, oh, crud, our money's gone. Well, some of it. Some of it. And so they're going to pass these acts to try to fix it. The Quartering Act, for example. 1765, the British make the colonists house and feed British troops. This is going to outrage many in the colonies. So like I told you, I mean, having soldiers living in your home isn't that good anyways. So if you're like a farm family and you have like sons and daughters, the last thing you want is somebody from overseas who's young and armed, sleeping in the same house. And they were supposed to provide so much things. Like the law was specific. You had to provide so many pounds of bread and meat and beer and money and a nice bed and all these things for these troops on a daily basis. Well, people are like, we can't afford this. And it imposed on their rights. They're like, no, this is tyranny. You're also going to have the Declaratory Act. Oh yeah, but why they had the Quartering Act is because they wanted British troops down there to police these people, not protect them, police them. So you have somebody who's there taking away your rights, and then you have to pay them and feed them, and they're not friendly to you. So they didn't like that. The Declaratory Act of 1766, Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act, but they're going to pass this law to replace it. And like, okay, we're going to get rid of that law, but here's the new one. This law stated that Parliament could pass laws with binding in colonies in all cases, whatever. So essentially, at first, the colonists thought they won. They got rid of the hated Stamp Act. But within that law, Parliament made its power more absolute. So like, careful what you wish for, kids. We might get rid of this, but in the language of the law, there's something that's going to come down on your head even harder. And so we're going to end with that right there. It's been over 30 minutes of lecture. And so as we press on, we're going to see how there's going to be more protest. We're going to see the colonists get together and form some form of emergency government. And then the war will begin. All right. So talk to you on Monday.